You called for me, didn't you? Well, I'm here.
She was 24 and broke. No home, no severance, no family room left to claim, just a canvas tool roll and $10 she had kept beneath the lining of her work shoe. And with that $10, she bought a condemned sail loft above an abandoned chandlery in Salem, Essex County, Massachusetts, a place struck from tax maps in 1976. The eastern roof sagged 6 inches. 3 windows had no glass at all. Essex County condemned it on September 14th, 2022, and scheduled demolition for the following spring. But inside a 200-foot oak rigging bench, behind a sealed tool compartment unopened for 89 years, waited money, papers, and one needle that would alter the measure of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Della Morrow had been stitching her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Lowell, she learned to judge a household by its hems. Her mother's work skirts were turned twice. Her own winter coat had sleeves lengthened with darker wool, and the kitchen curtains carried one careful repair where the sun had eaten through. Della understood early that poverty announced itself only when a seam failed in public. Her mother, Ruth, kept the mortgage coupons in a blue sugar bowl and sharpened pencils with a paring knife. She could make a pound of lentils last 4 suppers, but when an envelope bore a bank seal, her hands became still. She never opened such letters before noon. On Saturdays, Della took the bus to Marblehead and climbed the narrow stairs above Elias Morrow's marine repair shop. Elias, her grandfather, made sail covers, patched storm canvas, and repaired the heavy working sails of fishermen who could not afford replacements. He wore a leather sailmaker's palm strapped around his right hand, its dimpled metal plate polished bright by 40 years of needles. Their ritual never varied. He warmed beeswax near the stove, drew linen thread across it 3 times, then gave Della scraps of duck canvas and made her sew until each stitch leaned at the same angle. At noon they ate sardines on rye beside the cutting table while harbour bells sounded through the wall. Afterward he taught her to push, not stab, letting the palm drive the triangular needle through folded cloth while her left hand kept the layers honest. A sail does not survive because the wind is kind, Elias told her. It survives because every hidden stitch was made as if the storm had already begun. She carried that sentence without yet knowing where it belonged. He died in February of 2015 after shoveling wet snow from the shop steps. The landlord cleared the rooms before Ruth and Della could reach Marblehead. The palm, the needles, his notebooks, the brass fid, and the cedar chest of patterns went into an estate lot bought by someone whose name the auctioneer would not disclose. Della kept only the canvas tool roll Elias had once made for her. 7 years later, the garment plant where she worked changed its locks before dawn. A multinational name printed in silver letters across smoked glass had moved production overseas through a subcontractor and dissolved the local payroll company 2 days before severance came due. Managers spoke from behind a folding table while security officers watched the women empty their lockers. No one raised a voice. The fluorescent lights hummed over rows of idle machines, and unfinished shirt cuffs waited beneath lifted presser feet as though the workers had merely gone to lunch. The foreclosure followed quickly. On November 3, 2022, a deputy set Della's chipped yellow mixing bowl on the porch because it was the last loose object in the kitchen. Ruth stood behind the screen door in the house of a cousin who had agreed to take only one of them. She held Della's canvas roll against her chest, then passed it through without meeting her eyes. "You cannot stay here with me tonight." "Della." Exactly 8 words. The door closed softly. That softness was the betrayal. For 6 weeks, Della moved south and east by the cheapest routes she could find. She slept 2 nights beneath the reading room windows of the Lowell Library, where steam grates warmed one shoulder at a time. In Boston, she spent 3 nights upright in South Station, waking whenever the cleaning machine passed. Her $10 became $8.75 after a coffee and roll, then $6 after a bus to Lynn. She slept behind a laundromat there, under the exhaust vent, and washed her face before dawn in a pharmacy sink. In Peabody, a church basement opened during rain but closed at sunrise. By the time she reached Salem, she had $3.14, a bruised heel, and the habit of counting every doorway before darkness. Cold rain drove her into the Salem Public Library on Essex Street. She dried her sleeves beneath a hand blower, then sat before the classified board near the local history room. Most notices offered tutoring, snow removal, or rooms beyond her reach. One index card had curled brown edges and 4 typed lines: County Lien Sale, former sale Loft and Chandlery, cash deed $10, structure condemned, inquire county clerk. She read it twice, then placed one finger over the price as if the zero might move. At the reference desk, a librarian with a silver braid printed the parcel map without charge and circled the bus stop in pencil. Della folded the page into the canvas roll. By closing time, the rain had turned thin and cold. She still had the $10 bill Elias had sewn beneath the roll's inner binding years before, separate from the coins in her pocket. She had never spent it because his stitches had made it difficult to reach. That night, beneath the library awning, Della opened the seam with a borrowed safety pin and began walking toward the clerk's office before sunrise. The first bus carried Della north through a grey morning, past brick mills and marsh grass flattened by November wind. She rode as far as Beverly, then walked the remaining 9 miles because the transfer cost more than she had left. By dusk, rain had stiffened into sleet. She found an open hay barn beyond Danvers, climbed behind 3 square bales, and slept under her coat while the temperature fell to 27 degrees. Mice moved in the walls, the hay smelled of apples and dust. At sunrise, she followed Route 114 towards Salem, keeping the harbour wind on her right. The city gathered around her by degrees. McIntyre's bakery warming its windows, Crowley's fish market washing scales from the pavement, Bell and Cordage Marine Supply with rope in the doorway, Hawthorne Pharmacy lifting its iron gate, and Doris Vale's Harbour Cup Cafe sending coffee across Essex Street. The county clerk's office occupied the ground floor of an old granite building. Behind the final counter sat a woman with one cloudy blue eye and a black fountain pen clipped precisely to her collar. Her nameplate read MRS, Margaret Pike, Deputy Clerk. Mrs. Pike unfolded the parcel card. You understand the roof has failed. Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no heat. Yes, ma'am. You understand the well is untested. Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition remains authorized. Yes, ma'am. The clerk rested both hands on the counter. Her left thumb bore a dark groove from decades of turning paper. $10 does not make it safe. No, ma'am, Della said. It only makes it mine. Mrs. Pike pulled a deed from a drawer, squared it against the blotter, and indicated 3 signature lines. Della opened the inner seam of the canvas roll and laid Elias's bill on the counter. It had been folded so long that the centre crease stood like a ridge. The clerk looked at the money, then at the name Della had written. Morrow, she said. Any relation to Elias Morrow of Marblehead? He was my grandfather. Mrs. Pike removed her glasses. Elias, she said, had come to the records room every winter for nearly 20 years, tracing old sailmakers through tax ledgers and shipping manifests. He brought his own pencils and once repaired the canvas cover of a harbour register during lunch. This parcel had been the last property he asked about. In 2014, he had copied its ownership chain into a brown notebook. He said the building had been misnamed, Mrs. Pike told her. Not a chandlery with a loft above it. A sail loft with a shop beneath. Did he say why he wanted it? He said his mother's people worked there. Then he closed the ledger and never came back. The clerk slid the bill beneath her blotter rather than into the cash drawer. She pressed a heavy brass stamp into red ink and brought it down on the deed with a sound like a small door closing. Then she gave directions, east on Essex, left at Webb Street beyond the old rope walk lot, then down Derby Street until the pavement narrowed beside a boarded cooperage. Outside, Della walked past Derby Wharf and the dark ribs of moored boats. Near the rope walk lot, An old man in a green watch cap pruned a walnut sapling beside his fence. His black dog watched without barking. "That loft yours now?" he asked. She nodded. He closed the pruning knife. "Roof leaks east. Floor holes west." The dog smelled the canvas roll and returned to him. Beyond them, 4 mature walnut trees leaned over a lane where broken shells clicked beneath Della's shoes. The building appeared gradually, its lower story weathered brick and its upper length timber framed, sheathed in grey clapboards pale as bone. It ran nearly 200 feet from street to marsh, but scarcely 24 feet across, a long shape made for laying sails at full stretch. Cedar shingles showed beneath patches of rusted tin. A square brick chimney rose at the western end, missing its cap. Over the shop door hung a split sign whose remaining letters read Morrow and Hale, sailmakers. The county key resisted twice. On the third turn, the lock opened and released air scented with mouse droppings, cold ashes, beeswax, and pine tar. The front room held a scarred counter, empty shelves, and glass gritty underfoot. Her fingertips came away black from the wall. Somewhere above, a shutter tapped. A narrow stair rose behind the counter. At the top, the loft opened in one unbroken run, dim at the western end and silver near the missing eastern panes. Canvas rolls lay on racks along the wall, their edges hardened by age. When she pressed one, it yielded like old leather. Dust settled on her tongue with a mineral bitterness. Beneath it remained the stubborn odour of waxed thread and resin, as though work had stopped only an hour earlier. The back room held the chimney, a cast-iron stove with a warped lid, and the oak rigging bench beneath the south windows. Della tried the pump handle at the sink. It groaned but gave no water. She found an enamel cup, a broken broom, and 3 dry walnut shells arranged along the sill. Darkness arrived before she finished sweeping one clear place on the western floor. She ate half a heel of bread and drank from a public fountain 2 streets away. Returning, she wedged the door with a timber offcut, wrapped herself in the canvas roll, and lay beside the cold stove. Wind passed through the empty panes and moved the loft's hanging threads so softly that they seemed to breathe. Near midnight, the building answered the harbour with a long timber sigh. Della placed one hand on the floor and felt the vibration travel through oak, nails, and joists older than anyone who had warned her away. She did not sleep again, but she did not leave. No matter how savage the storm, strong stitches would hold the sail to the wind. At first light, Della carried the enamel cup to the yard and found the well beneath a warped plank cover. The rope had rotted through, but the iron pump beside it still held pressure after 40 strokes. Brown water coughed from the spout, then ran clear enough to wash with. She boiled it before drinking. The outhouse leaned toward the marsh, its door secured by copper wire, and she learned to place one foot against the lower hinge when the wind came inland. For 3 days she studied the loft as another person might study a difficult animal. The 7th board from the stair squealed under the heel. The long seam beside the south wall remained quiet. 2 joists near the broken windows gave a low complaint when she carried weight across them, so she moved the canvas rolls one at a time and stacked them over the brick partition below. By the 3rd night she could cross the dark floor without waking every nail. Bell and Cordage Marine Supply was kept by Walter Bell, a narrow man whose white left eyebrow grew in a single untamed wing. His shop smelled of kerosene, hemp rope, and the iron stove where a dented kettle trembled all day. Wooden drawers behind the counter bore labels written by 3 generations of hands. Della placed her deed beside the register and asked the price of a chimney brush. Walter read her name, glanced toward the harbour, and returned the deed. "Cash account or credit?" "I have 14 cents. "That answers half the question." She told him the stove was sound, but the flue was not. He studied the cracked skin across her knuckles, then opened a ruled ledger. "I can give you 30 days. I may need more. Then you'll owe me longer." He wrote Della Morrow, Sail Loft across the top of a clean page. With the brush and rods, she included a water-stained manual titled Repairs for the Owner-Built House. "Free," he said, "because whoever wrote it already suffered." She bought only what the first week required: a 6-inch wire chimney brush for $3.40, 2 threaded fiberglass rods at $1.25 each, a galvanized pail for 85 cents, stove cement for $1.20, and 12 feet of cotton clothesline for 60 cents. Walter added a paper packet of matches without entering them in the ledger. Back at the loft, Della removed the stove lid and stuffed the firebox with damp newspaper to catch falling soot. She tied the brush to the rods, then knotted the clothesline around her waist and climbed the roof from the western shed, testing each shingle before committing her weight. The chimney had no cap. She lowered the brush until its wire bristles rasped against the flue, worked it down in short strokes, withdrew it, and repeated the passage until the sound changed from rough scratching to hollow iron. The first bucket filled with dry soot. The second held black flakes of creosote thick as broken pottery. Twice the rods jammed at the smoke shelf, and she had to descend, reach through the stove collar, and loosen the obstruction with a bent spoon. She worked 6 hours the first day and 4 the next, her shoulders trembling whenever she lifted the brush above the chimney rim. On the third afternoon, she sealed a hairline crack in the stove collar with cement, waited until dusk, then burned a twist of newspaper beneath the flue. The smoke rose cleanly. She added cedar splinters, 2 pieces of dry oak from the yard, and finally a short length of walnut, too punky for carpentry. The stove began with a faint metallic ticking. Then heat moved into the room. Della sat on the floor close enough to warm her knees and cooked oats in the enamel cup with water, salt from a café packet, and the final half of an apple the librarian had given her. Steam dampened her face. It was the first hot meal she had eaten beneath a roof of her own. The next morning she opened the eastern workroom to daylight. The rigging bench ran beneath 6 windows, its oak top polished into shallow hollows where generations of sailmakers had sat. Beside it stood a cutting table marked with arcs, triangles, and faded measurements. A rack held 3 wooden fids, each tapered by use. She found a copper grommet die, a spool frame with 1 bone spindle, a palm with its leather strap severed, 6 sail needles furred with rust, and a broad pattern weight shaped like a whale. At the far end, under a collapsed canvas roll, lay a handwritten manual swollen by damp but still legible. Its pages showed flat seams, corner patches, reef points, and the proper angle for driving a 3-sided needle. Della set it near the stove to dry slowly. She did not turn more than 2 pages at a time. The bench had drawers for twine, needles, wax, and palm leather. Most opened after she cleaned their runners with candle grease. One did not. The locked section was not unusual by itself. What troubled her was its sound. When she tapped the oak above the other drawers with the whale-shaped weight, the bench answered in a dense, blunt note. Above the locked section, it answered higher. She tested it again. Then she knelt and pressed both hands against the bench's underside. The left half bore the weight of solid oak. The right half shifted slightly when she lifted. Not enough to move, but enough to tell her that a cavity had been built inside a cavity. She cleared the floor and examined every joint. No nail heads had been disturbed. The rear board fitted too closely for a pry bar. Along the inner lip of the tool well, beneath a skin of black wax, her thumbnail found a circular edge. Della warmed the wax with a rag soaked in hot water. A cedar disc emerged, no wider than a quarter, its grain running opposite the oak around it. She pushed. Nothing happened. She turned it clockwise and felt a wooden catch withdraw somewhere inside the bench. The drawer moved half an inch. It was heavier than a tool drawer should have been. Della looped the clothesline through its iron pull, braced both feet against the bench, and leaned back until the runners released with a dry wooden groan. The drawer came out 12 inches and stopped against a hidden peg. Inside were sailmakers' tools wrapped in oilcloth, 2 polished palms, a brass fid, a lignum vitae seam rubber, and a packet of triangular needles darkened but uncorroded. Beneath them lay a bundle of flax canvas, fine and tightly woven, protected by waxed linen. Its folded edge still held the grassy scent of fibre. The visible bottom was false. She knew because the drawer remained too heavy after she removed everything. Using the narrowest fid, she traced the corners until its point entered a notch concealed beneath the rear cleat. The bottom lifted on one side. Below it were 4 packages bound with tarred twine. Della carried them to the cutting table and waited until her hands stopped shaking. She cut no knots. Elias had taught her that knots could explain the hands that tied them, so she loosened each turn with the fid and laid the cord straight. The first package contained folded vellum covered with calculations, sail profiles, wind angles and pressure figures written in several inks. One drawing showed the sail plan of a 19th-century clipper, its margins crowded with corrections made by an unnamed assistant whose initials appeared only as EM. The curves had been adjusted again and again, each line searching for the point where force became speed. With the second held a narrow walnut case. Inside, on faded blue velvet, lay a single sail needle made of pale, untarnished metal. It was heavier than steel and marked near the eye with a minute anchor. Della did not yet know it was platinum. She only knew no working sailmaker would have owned such a thing casually. The third package contained a tin dispatch box sealed with green wax. The wax broke under the warmth of her thumb. Inside were bank envelopes, paper currency in linen bands, and 4 small cloth purses. A letter lay on top, addressed in brown ink, "My dear one, whoever you are." Della set the letter aside unopened. She counted the money because counting was an action and actions could be completed. The bills were old but lawful, hundreds, 50s, 20s, and a narrow bundle of 10s. The purses held 12 Liberty Head double eagles, 8 half eagles, 17 Morgan silver dollars, and 31 Indian head cents. Beneath the coins rested a Spanish-American War Campaign medal dated 1898. Its ribbon faded almost white. She counted once at the table, once on the floor, and once more after arranging every denomination into exact rows. $49,700. The amount did not change. Della wrapped the money again and returned it to the tin box. She placed the medal beside the walnut case, covered the vellum with clean canvas, and carried the unopened letter to the stove. The handwriting leaned forward, patient and exact. It resembled Elias's hand enough to stop her, though the ink was older than he had been. Night gathered over the marsh before she could decide whether to break the seal. She took the letter outside instead. The tide was rising beyond Derby Wharf, lifting scraps of moonlight between the pilings. From the lane came the soft crack of walnut shells beneath the black dog's feet. Then silence. Della sat on the cold stone step with the envelope across her knees and watched dark water accept the wind without keeping its shape. No matter how savage the storm, strong stitches would hold the sail to the wind. Morning came pale through the eastern windows. Della heated water, washed the soot from her hands, and set the envelope beside the enamel cup. In full daylight she saw why the writing had stopped her. The capital M began with the same narrow hook Elias used on invoices, and every lower loop leaned forward as though the words were walking into weather. She opened the seal with the brass fid. "My dear one, whoever you are, Dr. Samuel H. Porter of Boston told me on October 6, 1933, that the pain beneath my ribs was cancer of the liver and that I should put my affairs in order before winter. He said it carefully, as if careful words could lighten a thing. I returned to Salem by train and came here because this loft has always been where our family finished what the sea began. Josiah Morrow opened this trade in 1811 after apprenticing at Newburyport. His daughter Mercy Morrow Hale, born in Salem in 1838, took the cutting floor when his eyesight failed. Mercy's son Nathaniel Hale carried the books from 1871 until his death, and Nathaniel's daughter, my mother Eleanor Hale Morrow, taught me the palm and needle in this room in 1889. 4 generations worked beneath these rafters before the trade closed on November 17, 1902. After that date, the building held more than 30 years of silence. My husband, Thomas Morrow, was lost at Belleau Wood in France on June 12, 1918. Our son Elias was then 7. I did not teach him here. I believed grief had made the work dangerous to love, and so I locked the tools away. That was my failure. Not his. There are things the hand should remember. Warm beeswax only until it softens, never past 145 degrees, or it will turn brittle when cold. For flax thread, use 1 part pine tar to 3 parts wax. Work together for 10 minutes. Drive the needle with the palm at a slight downward angle. Then pull until the stitch lies flat without puckering the cloth. When setting a corner patch, leave it under weight for 12 hours before punching the cringles. The money in this bench came from sale contracts, property rent, and the sale of my mother's silver. Use it to keep the roof above the work, not to raise yourself above others. The drawings belonged to an assistant whose calculations improved the sail plan of the Flying Cloud, though the master received the praise. The platinum needle was given to Mercy by a captain who survived Cape Horn beneath a sail she repaired. Inheritance is not the keeping of objects. It is the taking up of unfinished work with clean hands, exact measurements, and enough patience to correct what pride would leave crooked. Behind the back door, beneath the 3rd walnut tree, you will find Thomas's stone marker. Light the old whale oil lamp for him once. If it still survives, the house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Abigail Hale Morrow, October 21st, 1933. Della read the letter twice. The second time she placed 1 finger beneath each line of instruction, moving slowly as Elias had taught her to follow a pattern. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases, neither adding nor correcting a bend, and returned them to the envelope. Outside, the 3rd walnut tree stood nearest the marsh. Its roots had lifted the earth into long knuckles. Della cleared wet leaves with the edge of her boot, and found a low granite marker almost level with the ground. The letters were softened by 90 winters, but Thomas Morrow and 1918 remained readable. Beneath them, someone had carved a small sail under full wind. She stood there until cold entered through her soles. The old whale oil lamp waited on a shelf behind the cutting table, black with soot and missing half its wick. Della cleaned the burner with cotton thread, filled the reservoir with the little kerosene Walter had poured into a medicine bottle, and raised the flame no higher than a thumbnail. The glass chimney warmed, a dim circle settled over the tools, the letter and the medal. Within that circle other small mercies gathered. The librarian with the silver braid had printed a map without charging her. Mrs. Pike had kept Elias's $10 bill beneath her blotter, instead of dropping it into the county drawer. Walter Bell had opened a credit page when Della owned 14 cents. The old man by the walnut trees had given her the only warning that mattered. The floor held west. None of them had rescued her. Each had merely placed 1 sound board beneath her next step. There may have been a kindness like that in your own life, a meal left quietly, a ride offered, a door held open when pride made asking impossible. What small kindness once carried you farther than the giver could have known? That night, Della laid the 2 sailmaker's palms, the platinum needle, the medal, and Abigail's letter beside her blanket. The lamp burned low until the room smelled faintly of warm metal and old oil. She slept with one hand resting on the closed tin box. Snow came on December 2000, 7 inches by dawn, softening the lane and exposing every place the roof had failed. Meltwater fell through the eastern rafters in 3 steady lines. Della placed buckets beneath them, opened repairs for the owner-built house to the roofing chapter, and read it 3 times before climbing the ladder. The roof measured 24 feet across and 196 feet long, each slope a little over 13 feet. Allowing for waste and the sound western third, she calculated 43 squares of cedar shingles, 9 rolls of felt, and 38 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Walter Bell checked the figures with a carpenter's pencil and changed only the nail allowance. From beneath his counter he brought out a roofing hatchet with a square pole, a gauge notch, and a handle darkened by sweat. It had belonged to his brother, who had died 12 winters earlier. He would dislike it staying idle, Walter said. A former roofer named Amos Reddick arrived the following morning. He was 71, broad through the shoulders, and missing the tip of his right ear. He carried a coil of rope and refused the envelope in which Della had placed 2 old silver dollars. "Keep those indoors," he said. "Roofs don't take payment kindly." They worked 11 days. Amos showed her how to sister the split eastern rafter with a straight length of white pine, carriage bolts staggered so the old timber would not split further. They snapped a chalk line every 5 courses and worked upward from the eaves, leaving a measured exposure beneath each shingle. Her first nails bent. The next stood high. "That nail's proud." "Set it again." She struck each nail with 3 strokes, 1 to place it, 1 to drive it, 1 light tap to seat it without crushing the cedar. When a shingle split around the head, Amos pointed with his hatchet. "Pull it. Start with a clean hole." By December 14th, the eastern slope lay flat and deliberate beneath a ridge of new cedar. That night, rain struck the roof for 2 hours. Della moved through the loft with a lamp, checking each former leak. The buckets remained empty. The chimney waited until January, when cold revealed what soot had concealed. Several bricks had spalled along their faces, and mortar beneath the roofline powdered under Della's thumb. She could have sealed the surface and called it sound. Abigail's letter made that impossible. Walter supplied hydraulic lime and fireclay. For the flue joints, Della mixed 3 parts fireclay to 1 part lime, adding water by spoonfuls until the mortar held a ridge without slumping. Exterior joints received a softer lime mortar that could move with the old brick rather than forcing it to crack. For 3 weeks, temperatures remained in the 20s. She worked from a plank scaffold lashed to the rafters, raking failed joints to a depth twice their width, brushing away dust, then dampening each cavity before packing new mortar with a narrow pointing trowel. Every 15 minutes her bare hands went numb. Gloves dulled the touch needed to judge a full joint, so she kept them beneath her coat and warmed her fingers around the stovepipe. 3 bricks near the crown broke during removal. Amos found replacements behind a demolished smokehouse, their size close enough that Della dressed the edges with a mason's hammer. She rebuilt the crown with a slight outward slope and fitted a plain copper cap. On January 29th, she lit a test fire with newspaper, headar, and 2 dry oak splits. Della stood in the yard while Walter watched from the doorway. Smoke rose in a straight grey ribbon, cleared the crown, and drifted toward the harbour without spilling from a single joint. The loft floor was white pine, fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails whose black heads sat like seeds beneath the grime. Della drove none deeper. She used a nail set only where an edge had lifted, preserving the small irregular crowns that recorded the swing of an older hammer. A rental yard near the station charged $14 per day for a random orbit sander. She carried it back in a wheelbarrow and began at the western end where the boards were most stable. The first pass with 80 grit paper lifted soot and old varnish. The second at 120 removed the circular ghosts left by haste. The final pass at 220 was slow enough that she could feel loose fibers through the machine's handles. Dust entered everything. It lined her eyelashes, settled into the stove seams, and turned the washwater the colour of weak coffee. She vacuumed each board, wiped it with a barely damp cloth, and waited until no moisture remained before applying oil. The first coat disappeared almost at once. The second stayed long enough to be rubbed across the grain. After the third, she left the floor untouched for 48 hours, crossing the loft only along 2 suspended planks. The boards changed from dark honey near the windows toward mahogany where tar, wax, and many boots had entered the grain. It was not an even colour, and Della did not try to make it one. One morning she woke unable to lift the sander from the wall. She carried the enamel cup to the marsh and watched a great blue heron stand in the shallows, its body motionless while water moved around its legs. When it struck, the act was exact and brief. Della did no work that day. At dusk she returned, covered the machine against moisture, and went to bed without apology. There were 8 windows along the south wall. 3 had no glass. 4 held cracked panes patched with tape or newspaper. The 8th contained a single wavy sheet dated by its frame to 1788, its surface bending the walnut branches into watery lines. Della removed that pane herself and stored it upright between layers of felt. The others she repaired one sash at a time. She scraped loose compound without cutting the old wood, laid a thin bedding of DAP 33 glazing putty, and pressed each replacement pane until a narrow squeeze-out appeared along the inside edge. Glazier's points went in every 8 inches. The final putty bevel shed water cleanly toward the sill. The sash cords had rotted to brown lint. She replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot through the iron counterweight. The weights descended inside the wall with a solemn sound. When balanced correctly, the sash remained wherever she placed it. The original pane returned to the westernmost frame. She bedded it without forcing the corners and left its small bubbles untouched. On the last window, Della raised the lower sash to test the cord. A chickadee landed on the nearest walnut branch, no farther than her hand could reach through the opening. It tilted its black-capped head, struck the bark once, and flew toward the marsh. Della lowered the sash. The figure-8 knot held. The walls near the chimney were horsehair plaster over hand-split oak lath, each strip uneven, each gap holding an older coat. Della's first patch fell before supper. The second cracked overnight. The third stayed until she touched its edge, then released in one plate. Walter brought an old bag of horsehair from his shed. Della washed it, cut the long strands, and folded them into lime plaster until each handful held without becoming rope. She dampened the lath, pressed on a scratch coat, and scored it diagonally. The brown coat went on 3/8 of an inch thick and cured for 72 hours behind damp cloth. The finish coat was 1/8 of an inch, troweled until it carried the faint waves of the surrounding wall. These patches will hold another 100 years. She said it as a standard, not a promise. By March, useful things began appearing without ceremony. Doris Vale from the Harbour Cup Cafe came before opening, her red hair pinned with crossed pencils. She left paper bags of rye bread, boiled eggs, and sometimes apple cake. When Della offered payment, Doris folded her fingers over the dollar. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Caleb Reddick arrived on a blue Schwinn with a splitting maul across the handlebars. 16 on all wrists. She split the fallen walnut behind the outhouse and stacked it bark side up. Della offered him 2 silver quarters. He shook his head. "My mother said." "About your grandfather." Before leaving, she sharpened the maul and leaned it beside the wood pile. Reverend Boyd passed each morning in a dark coat polished at the elbows. He tipped his hat, paused beside Thomas's marker, and touched its carved sail. Keep her work steady. Then he continued toward the harbour. Della postponed the cellar until February 11th, when seepage slowed along the foundation. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor. At its centre rested a dressed granite slab marked with a carved palm and needle. The edges were too exact to be accidental. Della brushed the grooves and did not lift it. Under the 3rd stair, she found a small oak box. Inside lay a brass key whose bow formed a full-bellied sail, and a tintype wrapped in linen. The photograph showed a young woman outside the loft in 1903, a sailmaker's palm against her apron. Her mouth, brow, and steady gaze belonged so closely to Della that she set the plate down before turning it over. The inscription read, "Abigail Hale, daughter of Nathaniel, age 25. Summer of 1903, Della placed the key on the mantel. She tried it in no door. Snow withdrew from the lane. The creek grew loud with meltwater, and walnut catkins tapped the repaired panes when the wind turned south. Della cleaned Abigail's palms and copied 6 pages of the manual. She would not begin a full sail that spring. The work deserved stronger hands than hers had yet become. She exchanged $1 for flax thread, beeswax, a yard of canvas, and 3-sided needles. On small squares she practiced seams, corner patches, and cringles, cutting failed stitches out rather than letting them remain. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Della finished the first thing she was willing to call complete. It was a 12-foot storm trysail for a fisherman whose old canvas had split along the leach. She cut the cloth on the loft floor, allowed for stretch, and worked every seam with waxed flax. The palm drove the needle, the seam rubber flattened each row. At the corners she left layered patches beneath iron weights for 12 hours before punching the cringles. The fisherman inspected both sides, then ran one thumb across the zigzag stitches. Elias used to finish them like that. Della folded the sail without answering. The work had answered. The restored loft remained spare. 8 windows admitted low winter light, including the wavy pane that bent the walnut trees. The cutting table stood beneath the north wall, and the rigging bench remained scarred and usable. Nothing had been polished past recognition. The brass key waited until a windstorm tore a dead limb from the 3rd walnut tree. Beneath the bark, Della found an oval plate set flush with the trunk, green with age. At its centre was a keyhole. The sail-shaped bow fitted her palm. The key turned once. A brass cylinder slid from a cavity inside the walnut. Wrapped in oilskin were a folded 48-star flag and a note Abigail had written on November 11th, 191-8, the day the armistice ended the fighting in Europe. Thomas would not return to stand beneath the tree, she wrote, but his son might. The flag should remain out of weather until someone could unfold it without mistaking mourning for the whole of a life. Thomas had laughed loudly, hated weak coffee, and could splice wet rope in darkness. He had planted the walnut before leaving for France because a tree required no witness in order to grow. Della aired the flag across clean canvas, supporting each fold with tissue, then placed it in a cedar box built from salvaged boards. Abigail's note went beside the wartime letter. On June 12, 2024, the anniversary of Thomas Morrow's death, Della carried the 1898 medal to Green Lawn Cemetery in Salem. Reverend Boyd met her at the Veterans Monument. He read Thomas's name, and Della laid the medal beneath the bronze wreath for 1 hour before returning it to the tin box. The money remained where Abigail had placed it, with 4 exceptions. $1 Morgan bought practice materials. A half-eagle settled the hardware account after Walter refused the old paper bills. Another Morgan bought cedar for the flag box. 1 Indian head cent went beneath the rehung threshold, and Old Builder's custom Amos remembered. Every remaining bill and coin was listed in Abigail's ledger, wrapped in new linen, and returned to the hidden compartment. On top Della placed a card for the next one. You say's only what keeps the work alive. The shop reopened without a newspaper notice. Doris cleared space on the cafe corkboard. Della pinned up a white index card, canvas repairs. Sale covers. Hand-sewn work accepted slowly. Morrow and Hale sailmakers. Derby Street. Within a month, 43 names filled a composition book mailing list. Most wanted small work, a torn awning, a canoe cover, a sea bag with a failed bottom. Della accepted only what she could finish honestly. Her estimates included the weather, the age of the cloth, and the chance that she might refuse to sew new thread into fabric too weak to hold it. Caleb returned in April, carrying a plank wrapped in a horse blanket. He had grown broader, though the bicycle remained the same blue Schwinn. He set the plank on the cutting table and uncovered a walnut sign. Morrow and Hale followed the old proportions. Beneath it, smaller but cut just as deeply, were the words "and daughters." Della touched the fresh-cut ampersand. There were no daughters in the name. There are now. He had left the lower edge unfinished so her hand could be the last on it. Together they rubbed the walnut with oil. Amos steadied the ladder while Caleb fixed the sign above the door. Doris watched from across the street, and Reverend Boyd tipped his hat when the last screw seated. That evening, Della lit the whale oil lamp and opened a sheet of cream paper at the rigging bench. "My dear one, whoever you are," she wrote the date, the roof cost, Walter's mortar ratios, and the places where the floor should not be loaded during heavy rain. She explained which pane came from 1788 and why it must never be forced square. She described the hidden drawer but not the granite slab, because she still had not lifted it. Then she wrote that hands became ready by correcting the same motion until care entered the muscles. She named Doris, Walter, Amos, Caleb, Mrs. Pike, and the librarian whose name she had never learned. An inheritance, she wrote, was rarely carried by one family alone. Outside, harbour wind rose against the long wall. The new sign moved once and settled. Della threaded a needle, drew flax across warm wax, and repaired a cut in the canvas tool roll Elias had made for her. No matter how savage the storm, strong stitches would hold the sail to the wind. She folded her unfinished letter beneath Abigail's, leaving room for pages not yet written. Then she banked the stove, checked the eastern windows, and walked the 200-foot floor while the rafters kept the weather above her. The canvas sail loft waits. It has always waited. Mrs. Margaret Pike remained one more year before retiring. On her final afternoon, she lifted the old blotter. Elias's $10 bill still rested beneath it, its centre crease sharp. She placed it in the deed ledger beside Della Morrow's parcel number, closed the brass clasp, and left it for whoever opened the book next.